This talk is about Operation Freshman, which was the first Allied operation during the Second World War to stop the Germans' production of heavy water in Telemark, Norway, and about silent heroes, those who took part in the operation. I'd like to turn the clock back to 2006, when I first visited the Commonwealth graves in Egenes Cemetery in Stavanger together with my wife. It was the first time we'd been there, and we had no idea who they were or what they had been involved in. And we noticed that 25 of them had died around about the same date, the 19th and 20th of November 1942. And we became very curious about who they were and what they had been involved in. And there was also a memorial stone nearby to commemorate 4 others who had obviously been involved in the same operation, but who had no grave. And we later found out that 7 airmen were buried in a place called Helleland, about an hour and a half away from Stavanger, and that these also had been involved in the same operation, and that 5 were buried in Oslo, and that they too had been involved in the same operation in November 1942. And soon after, I was asked if I was interested in taking part in a research project about these casualties in Egenes and the related graves in other cemeteries. And I agreed to do so, and the product was a book called Silent Heroes, Operation Freshman, which I wrote together with 3 colleagues, Marie Smith-Solbakken, Helge Sogli, and Hans-Jørgen Wallin Weyer. And on the front cover of the book is the youngest of them all, Gerald Williams from Yorkshire, who was 18, who actually lied about his age in order to enlist. And the background for the photo of Gerald on the front cover is the letter that was sent by his officer to his mother, informing her that he was missing in action. And the letter was dated the 26th of November, 1942. Why silent? Well, first of all, they can't tell their story, so we have to tell it for them. And also, there was a great deal of silence around Operation Freshman for decades. Even the families were told very little about what had happened to their loved ones. And why heroes? Well, we normally associate heroes with success stories, but according to Salomonson's conversation lexicon, a hero is somebody who, with courage and energy, risks his life in the fight for a great cause that benefits mankind. And that definition seems to be appropriate to the subjects of this talk. The aims of the book were to combine war history and the personal perspective, the stories of those who were involved. Who were they? What mission had they been involved in? How did they die? How had their families coped with the loss of their loved ones? What were their families actually told about what had happened? And how have these casualties been honoured and remembered since? We sent the book to various museums and organisations, and the director of the Glider Salt Museum wrote back saying, "What makes it stand out from all the other wartime stories that I have read is the extremely personal nature of individual people and their stories." In this photo, we see Per Jonsson on the left and Peter Yates on the right. And they are 2 local historians who gave us invaluable help with our book. They had both done research into Operation Freshman. Per Jonsson about the Norwegian perspective. He had interviewed witnesses who had been at crash sites and so on. And Peter Yates from the UK, who had come into contact with a number of people who had been involved in Operation Freshman. And both of them passed on invaluable research data to us. And in the middle is Eric Mills, a veteran from the Airborne Forces who arrived in Stavanger in 1945, with the liberation forces, met his wife, settled down in Stavanger, and tended to the graves in Egenes for many years. The rest of this talk will be devoted to, first of all, what was Operation Freshman, second, about some of the participants who took part in it, and then finally about how they have been honoured and remembered. The target for Operation Freshman was the heavy water plant in Vemork, Telemark, that produced heavy water, and the Allies feared that the Germans would use the heavy water to produce an atomic bomb. The Germans had been in control of this plant since the invasion of Norway in April 1940. Churchill and Roosevelt were very aware of the danger and decided that something had to be done to stop the production, and it had to be done without delay. So the plan that was approved in October 1942 was to send 30 Royal Engineers in 2 Horsa gliders towed by 2 Halifax bombers, and to land quite near the plant, to make their way on foot, to sabotage it, and then to escape to Sweden in pairs. And Sweden was about 300 kilometers away. Now, this was the first time that the Allies had used gliders in combat during the Second World War, and gliders had never been used at such a great distance before. None of these men could ski or speak Norwegian, so the chances of them surviving were minimal. They had about 1 month to prepare, and some of that preparation took place near Mount Snowdon in Wales, marching up and down hills, so-called toughening up training, living rough, sleeping rough. In addition, they were given training in explosives, how to kill guards without making a sound, and they saw a model of the plant in Vemork, but at that time they didn't really know what it was or its significance. Corporal Sidney Britton had volunteered to take part in Operation Freshman. About a week before the actual operation took place, he injured his ankle and was told that he would then be unable to take part. And for decades he kept silent about his involvement in this operation, even to his family. And then finally, in the 1980s, he met Peter Yates, and Peter Yates got him to talk and tell his story. And Peter Yates interviewed him several times and transcribed those interviews, and he passed them on to us so that we could use them in our book. And they provide a unique account of that month of training and preparation before Operation Freshman took place. For example, Britain was able to tell us how the men had volunteered. In fact, they were chosen by their officers and told to meet in an assembly room one morning, and then the officers came in and Lieutenant Colonel Henniker said to them something on the following lines: "The Germans are producing something, and unless we stop them, the war will be over in 6 months, and not with an Allied victory. So any one of you who doesn't want to take part can get up now and leave." Well, it took much more courage to stand up in front of your comrades and leave than it did to actually take part in a military operation. So no one left. And Sidney Britton stayed with the men for security reasons for the rest of the training, and right up to the time when they departed from Wick on the 19th of November. And they left in Horsa gliders like this one pictured here. And inside the glider, it would have looked something like this, but far from as cozy as this. because the gliders would have been tossed to and fro, up and down. It would have been freezing inside. The men would have been vomiting and so on, and this lasted for many hours. And then in the late afternoon of the 19th of November 1942, two combinations of Halifax bombers and Horsa gliders took off from Skitten airfield near Wick in northeast Scotland on the way to Vemork in Norway. And right from the start, things started to go wrong. The intercom system between the bombers and the gliders failed. One of the bombers had engine trouble the day before on a reconnaissance flight. The weather conditions were far from optimal, but nevertheless, the signal was given to go ahead. The four glider pilots in the Horsa gliders were probably the best that were available, two from Scotland and two from Australia. They had been hand-picked, and in the air they were pilots. On the ground, they would have taken part in the operation together with the other soldiers. But Operation Freshman went terribly wrong. The combinations never managed to locate the target zone, the landing site. The weather deteriorated. They tried to make their way back to base. Ice formed on the tow ropes, which became heavy, and ultimately both tow ropes snapped. And one glider crashed in a place called Fyljestalen in the Rogaland, and the other glider crashed in a place called Helleland, also in the Rogaland. And 8 of the Royal Engineers died in the Fyljestalen crash, 6 engineers, and the 2 pilots. And in the Helleland crash, the 2 pilots and 1 Royal Engineer died. And then one of the bombers, the one in Helleland, apparently tried to locate where the glider had crashed, and that plane also crashed into the side of a mountain. This happened round about midnight on the 19th of November 1942. But there were survivors from both gliders, and in both cases some of the survivors managed to make their way down to local farms and got into contact with some of the locals and asked for help. And they were told, well, in order to get medical help, we will have to contact the Germans. And in both cases, they agreed. But what they didn't know was that Hitler had issued a so-called commando order that any commandos involved in sabotage operations were to be executed without delay. Had they known that, they would never have surrendered as they did. And the 14 survivors from the glider that crashed in Helleland were taken to a German prison camp in Sletterbø near Egersund the morning after, and they were interrogated, and then in the afternoon they were led out one by one with about 50 meters in between into the woods behind the camp, and there they were executed by a firing squad. And one can imagine what was going through their heads as each one of them heard shots in front of them and must have been so confused and afraid. And then the same evening they were buried in a mass grave in the sands in a place called Brusand on the coast of Jæren, and the Germans obviously tried to hide this deed. But a local farmer witnessed it, and then after the war he was able to point out the exact spot, and the bodies were dug up and reinterred in Egenes. The 9 survivors from the glider that crashed in Fyljestalen were taken to the Gestapo prison in Stavanger, and 4 of them were very badly wounded. Those 4 were given morphine, allegedly in an attempt to kill them. However, it didn't work, and they were then strangled to death in the most brutal way. 3 of them. 1 of them was shot in the back of the head, and the 4 bodies were dumped in the sea near a place called Kvitsøy and never found. And this was considered as a war crime, and some of those who had been involved in the deaths of these 4 soldiers were given sentences of death after the war. The other 5 were, for some reason, allowed to live for another couple of months, and they were taken to Oslo, and then in January 1943 they too were executed, and they are buried in Oslo. And now to some of those who were involved in Operation Freshman. Ernest Pendlebury was one of the 3 who died in the glider crash in Helleland, together with the 2 Australian pilots. And he was from Yorkshire and had recently got married to Marjorie, and this is from his wedding photo. And on his right is a young man, his younger brother, Jeff Pendlebury. And no one had ever visited Ernest Pendlebury's grave until, in 2010, his great niece, Natalie Grimmer, came to Stavanger with her family, husband and 2 sons. And here we see them at Ernest Pendlebury's grave in Egernes. And what is perhaps not so clear is that Natalie is holding a phone to her ear, and she's actually talking to Ernest's brother Jeff in Australia. And one can imagine the significance of this moment. He had never been able to make it to Stavanger himself. In fact, he had once tried, but had to give up and return because his wife got seriously ill. And here is somebody from the family almost 70 years later for the first time by that grave. And before she left the grave, Natalie laid a photo, the wedding photo, of Ernest and Marjorie at the foot of the grave. And it's quite common for family members who visit the graves to leave something by the grave. They also went up to the actual crash site in Helleland, where there is a memorial to the 2 Australian pilots. And once again, there is telephone contact between the Grimmer family and Jeff Pendlebury. This time, it's one of the sons talking to Jeff Pendlebury in Australia, saying, now we are by the actual spot where Ernest died in 1942. The officer who was in charge of the operation was Lieutenant Charles Allen. He was 24. He had been with the men the whole time, and he had a natural authority over them, and they respected him. The other officer was Lieutenant David Methven, and he was only 20, and he wasn't supposed to go on Operation Freshman, but he was called in as a last-minute replacement because the other officer who was supposed to originally go also injured himself, like Sidney Britton, and David Methven was asked to go, and he wrote a letter to his mother saying, now I'm going to take part in some real action, I'm lucky, and he was very excited about it. And we came into contact with David Methven's niece, Lucy Smith, and she gave us lots of personal letters that he had written, that other family members, especially his mother, had written. She gave us photographs, she gave us other documentation. And one letter that was written on the 1st of October 1945 was a letter from David's mother to her sister-in-law, just after she had been given final confirmation of the death of her son. And she wrote, "The Norwegians are good, and one feels grateful to them for their care. I am certain that they would do all they could. And then she talks about a vision that she had had. And so my vision was true. And when people said at first that David would come back, I always saw it. And he was lying so peacefully as if asleep, warmly clad, so that I knew he hadn't gone very far. And her vision was of his shallow grave in Fyllesdal, where he was buried because he was one of the 8 who died in the crash there, and it wasn't until after the war that his body was dug up and reinterred in Egenes. Well, in commemoration of the casualties, a Remembrance Sunday ceremony is held in Egenes every year, and it's attended by military personnel from the NATO base there, Army, Navy and Air Force personnel, and also civilians. And the name of each casualty is read out aloud. National anthems are sung and wreaths are laid. And in 2012, to mark the 70th anniversary of Operation Freshman, a number of the families were represented at the Remembrance Day ceremony. And the director of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission also attended that ceremony. Of all the places in the world, he was in Stavanger. Some final words are about Corporal Bill Bray, who is here pictured with his wife Lily. They lived in a village near Edenbridge in Kent, and when Bill Bray left for Operation Freshman, his wife Lily was pregnant. And just a few hours before he left Wick on that faithful mission, he wrote his final letter back home to Lily. And this is what he said. My own dearest one, just a few lines in haste to let you know I'm just off on a raid. I can't say where, but don't worry too much, darling, if you don't hear for a couple of weeks or so. But I shall be back for Christmas, so get that chicken ordered up. I'm sorry I can't stop for more now, but I'm due on parade in 5 minutes. So cheerio for the present. Darling, remember I love you and adore you. Don't worry too much, dear, because I shall be back. So bye-bye, and God bless you. From your ever-loving hubby, Billy. But of course, Bill Bray didn't come back. And this is a photo of his son, Dennis Bray, by his father's grave in Egenes. And Dennis Bray also attended the 2012 memorial service, the 70th anniversary of Operation Freshman. And Norwegian television was also present there and interviewed him and showed that interview on the evening news, television news in Norway. And they asked him if he thought that his father was a hero, thinking about the well-known heroes of Telemark, the successful saboteurs who blew up the plant some months later. And Dennis Bray said, yes, my father was a hero. And then he said, and this is the closest that I've ever been to my father. And he meant physically standing by his grave was the closest he'd ever been, because he was born a few months after his father died. And Dennis Bray embodies why it's so important to keep remembering and honouring those silent heroes like Bill Bray, whose lives were so prematurely terminated and whose families had to live on with uncertainty and unimaginable grief, but who have never forgotten.